and welcome to Long Shorts. I'm Emily Baum, and today I'm here with Andrew Liu, an assistant professor of history at Villanova University and author of the very recently published book, Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. Andy, thanks so much for talking with me today, and congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to the conversation.
So maybe to get started, you can just give us a brief synopsis of the book. What is the tea war that you're referring to in the title?
So the book traces the rise of the Chinese tea, the export tea industry out of China from the mid-19th to mid-20th century, alongside the rise of the colonial tea industry, the colonial Indian tea industry. So the tea war refers to the competition between the two industries. And the way the book is structured is this kind of a back and forth, where we have a chapter on what happens in China after the Opium Wars, the creation of the treaty ports, which leads to this huge explosion of both production and distribution and overseas sales of tea. But then we go to a chapter on India, where we talk about how the British colonial planters and officials set up what is today the Indian tea industry in the Northeast Territory of Assam. And this produces its own backlash and reaction in China and so on and so on. So it's a back and forth story trying to trace the competition, obviously, the process of competition between the two industries, and how I try to argue how you can't really understand one without the other, that what's happening in colonial India is a reaction to what's happening in China and vice versa, all the way to the 20th century. So implicit is also a methodological argument about how to write economic history, how to write the history of capitalism in this part of the world. One can't simply stay within one country and talk about local, cultural, natural differences. One has to think about these processes as transnational and dynamic throughout.
So you say in the introduction that you're trying to write a history of capitalism in marginalized places. So how does the history of capitalism look different from the perspective of China and India versus, say, the perspective of the United States or Western Europe?
Yeah, so I begin the book by getting into this extended conversation about economic history and how the history of capitalism traditionally has been written. It is almost always focused on, for lack of a better term, the North Atlantic world, and primarily England, but also the Northern United States. There are a lot of assumptions that are shared between scholars of different schools, from the Marxists to the neoclassicals, but the basic presupposition has been capitalism is equated with modern economic growth. So it's almost a technical definition that a society is capitalist once it's able to achieve these massive gains of growth in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the way to explain that has typically been in terms of the greater commodification of things. So the commodification of land, the commodification of the liberalization, creation of capital markets, the commodification of money itself, but also especially labor, right? This is central to Marxist explanations, but shared with neoclassicals. And the explanation has typically been that when everything is on the marketplace, they can be more rationally allocated and reallocated, much more so than compared to this thing called feudalism or slavery or whatever came before it. Now, I don't disagree that capitalism is distinguished by these massive economic gains of the last 200 years. I guess my main point of disagreement is to suggest that these technical achievements are not the cause of capitalism. We can't equate these with capitalism. They are the result of some deeper transformations of society. And those social transformations could lead to a variety of different results. In this book, I begin with the premise that tea was very clearly integrated with the global circuit of commodities that we typically associate with the history of capitalism. Cotton, sugar, but also like opium, silk, right? But if one has a purely localistic analysis and kind of follows these technical models, neither the Chinese tea districts nor the Indian tea districts looked like England, right? And that has typically resulted in scholars saying China was pre-capitalist until 1940 something. The Indian tea plantation was pre-capitalist until the 20th century or so. My suggestion is that if we're going to think about places beyond the North Atlantic that do not fit those models, we have to kind of think about these social dynamics rather than only looking for the end result, which were like mechanization, steam engines, electricity, the sort of spectacular gains of the modern economic world.
So why do you choose to focus on tea specifically rather than on other commodities that we also associate with China, like, as you mentioned, silk and porcelain, or even opium?
Very early on, I was interested in connecting China to the rest of the, what's called the post-colonial world, the rest of Asia. So it's trying to get out of these east-west configurations and thinking about what some have called horizontal connections within Asia. And I was particularly kind of inspired by the literature in South Asian history. So for me, opium and then later tea were sort of the obvious connections. And as I dug into it more, it seemed very clear to me there was a very substantive history to tell of the creation of the Indian tea industry, but also the transformations of the Chinese tea industry.
Throughout the book, you move back and forth between China and India. So methodologically, why was it important for you to do a multi-sided history?
It's very clear when you read these materials, and I think this is probably true of a lot of regional industries, that what's going on in China cannot be fully understood unless you also understand the effect they're having on their quote unquote competitors in India, but later Japan and Taiwan and the Dutch East Indies, and also how they're reacting to those transformations later on, right? There's no reason to focus on the nation state or the region exclusively. It's always important to kind of look at the broader picture. When I was reading the literature on Chinese tea by China historians, and then Indian tea by India historians, there's a lot of really useful information in all that literature, but they're kind of making these, I think, simplistic assumptions about these wide differences. Just through comparative research, you could find that a lot of things that appear different, and that perhaps most importantly, contemporaries are saying are very different, you can actually find that those differences are overstated. And there's a lot more similarities and combined processes that you might not expect.
Bringing the conversation up to the present, you recently had an op-ed published in The Guardian. You argued that if we really want to understand the coronavirus, we have to take into consideration market forces. Could you explain what you mean by this?
Yeah, so I think what these articles share in common with my book is this basic goal of mine, I think, in a lot of my research, which is to say that a lot of times people typically look at China and they try to explain China through culturalistic explanations, saying this is about, Confucianism, let's say, but also, let's say, it's about the land or some naturalistic explanation, which would confine causality and explanation to just this particular place called China, and in a kind of timeless sense, right? So when I first wrote these papers or these articles, this was the time in March when the Donald Trump administration was, constantly referring to the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, and there's a lot of talk about how the virus was caused primarily by the sort of barbaric cultural traditions of eating wildlife and pangolin in particular. So in the article, I was arguing that this explanation that the coronavirus is generated out of this barbaric Chinese habit of eating wildlife is empirically wrong. And more generally, I think another thing in common with my historical research is that what people misrecognize as this innate cultural thing with Chinese people or Chinese culture could also be explained probably more fruitfully as a byproduct of global connections between China and the rest of the world.
So then would it be accurate to say that the same type of globalizing market forces that were at play in the tea wars of the 19th century are still at play in the spread of the coronavirus today?
One doesn't want to assume a pure continuity. There's a lot of things that happened, of course, between the 19th century and the 21st century. But certainly, I think when I was thinking about my book and writing this project, I was very much influenced by thinking about China as its dynamic and global force today, probably to an unprecedented degree. I think in the 19th century, China is part of a globalized market in a very different way than the 21st century. For one thing, it has a lot more, economic and political sovereignty today. They're a lot more in control. The Chinese government is a lot more in control of their economic fate. But I do think one thing that kind of jumped out to me as I was putting the finishing touches on my book and trying to think about the contemporary relevance of the book is that I think the reason that a lot of historians have overlooked the economic dynamism of the 19th century is because they thought capitalism has to look a certain way. It's the sort of secular tendency towards centralization and vertical integration and larger firms and larger workforces and greater mechanization of production. And that looked very much like the case in the mid 20th century with like development studies, modernization theory, et cetera. What has helped historians and scholars kind of chip away at that very stage-based model of history is the rise of Asia over the last several decades, where you've seen not just China, the entire East Asia region has been able to stay competitive for a variety of reasons, including political reasons. But among them is the fact that there actually is a certain economic logic to having small scale producers who work from the house, people who are seasonal part-time workers rather than full-time employees.
Well, Andy, thanks again for talking with me today, and congratulations on the publication of a fascinating book. I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of conversation.
Thanks for having me.